IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Anirudh, and last week we had a pretty interesting discussion at the Arthashastra office, which we wanted to share with all of you. This was about whether a civilisational worldview can be thought of as influencing the grand strategy of particular countries. Now, I'm sure that a lot of our listeners may have heard of the so-called Middle Kingdom or Tianxia mentality that China supposedly has. According to this argument, the way that China fundamentally thinks about international relations, the way that China fundamentally approaches its relations not just with its neighbors but with the world at large, is structured by a particular kind of historical mindset, which saw the Chinese emperor, the Chinese son of heaven, the Huangdi, as being the foremost among all the rulers of the world. According to this conception of civilization, the Chinese were the only truly civilized culture, and they were only surrounded by barbarians. The Chinese could agree to trade with these barbarians and bestow various honors on them, but these barbarians could not really be thought of as civilized or be thought of as China's equals unless they spoke the Chinese language, unless they wore Chinese costumes and adopted many other forms of Chinese cultural practice. The son of heaven mentality is something that's fairly well attested. We know from a series of very colorful Chinese code documents going as far back as the 11th century and even before, that a number of states, including a lot of Indian states such as the Chola and Vijayanagara empires, sent embassies to China where the Chinese quite colorfully described them as barbarians coming to beg the favor of the Chinese emperor. Now, the reason for my disagreement with this whole idea is because of the way that few scholars and more generally how lay people tend to say that, hey, you know what, this is what China was doing 1,000 years ago. China thought of itself as the foremost country of the world and everybody else as being barbarians. And you can very clearly see that China does the exact same thing now. It doesn't respect any of its neighbors. It's always about bossing people around because they think of themselves as the true and rightful heirs of this grand civilization and think of themselves as the most civilized on earth. Now, that's something that I have a lot of issues with as a history nerd because I've seen similar arguments being advanced in the context of India's grand strategy. Very often you hear ideas being bandied about like Kautilya, who was the author of the Arthashastra, had an idea that one must unite the Indian subcontinent by all means, and the unification of the Indian subcontinent has been the goal of all Indian governments. And if you look at the foreign policy of Nehru, or if you look at Morarji Desai, you can see that they were following this Kautilyan idea, which I think can be explained using a number of other perfectly convenient contemporary explanations. So what we're going to do over the course of this podcast is really try to unpack what guides the way that various nation states approach the problem of grand strategy, how they decide what their national goals should be, how they decide what their approach to their neighbors should be, what their objectives should be, how they're going to use their resources to achieve those objectives, and whether one can say that some kind of civilisational worldview, some kind of, how do I put this, some kind of habitus, some kind of underlying thing that is inherent in that particular culture's view of the world can ever be said to guide foreign policy in today's multipolar world. So please welcome Suyash and Pranay. Hi guys.
Hi Anirudh.
So let's start the discussion with you, Suyash. Can you tell us a little bit about the conception of Chinese grand strategy? How has it evolved over the last few decades? And what do you think are its relations to the old Middle Kingdom mindset, if any?
So you used very interesting introduction, Anirudh. You said influencing worldview at the start, and then you said that it is a part of their ideology. I would like to believe that influencing worldview is the right nomenclature because it is just one of the influences, one of the factors that influences the grand strategy. There are many other major factors, and the civilizational part plays a very small or a minimalistic role in influencing today's grand strategy. Why? First of all, I'll just introduce in 1 second. Give me 2 seconds to introduce what is grand strategy. Grand strategy is a strategy or is a way of forwarding national interest using various tools of statecraft. These are diplomatic. This can be diplomatic, military, political, economic tool, all to put together to form a strategy to conduct statecraft. This is grand strategy. China or any other nation state in this world, the grand strategies of these nation states are derived basically on three factors. These three factors are structures in which they are existing, the power dynamics between these countries and nation state, and the quest for survival. So in my understanding, I play this as more important than the civilisational aspect. Yes, civilisational aspect is an add-on to this as per their convenience, but these three are more important factors in deriving a grand strategy. And more important of them is survival. In case of the People's Republic of China, it fits in very appropriately. Also in case of India, as you will highlight later. But why in case of People's Republic of China? I would like to delve into the strategy that People's Republic of China adopted from 1949 to 1989. And this was purely on the base of survival. Today we see China as an emerging superpower or one of the important power pillars in the world. But after formation in 1949, China was not so much powerful, and there were existential threats to the country and the regime from inside and outside. And this existential threat to the survival of the regime and the nation state led China to do various things. For example, their Sino-Soviet alliances under Mao Zedong in 1950s, early 1960s, which also led to China becoming nuclear in the initial stages. The rapprochement with United States when Soviet emerged as a threat, that was also based on survival, because your nuclear threat is on your neighborhood, doorstep. So these led to the rapprochement with US. This was again based on survival. And the continuation of Sino-US alignment was basically for its own survival, gaining military background and economic cooperation. So largely from 1949 to 1989, survival was the key factor or the key node more than civilization for deriving the Chinese grand strategy or Chinese tools of diplomacy.
How was the conquest of Tibet and the colonization of Xinjiang necessary for China's survival, though, Suyash?
Tibet was essentially a quest for survival because legitimacy. Tibet, there are few areas which gives legitimacy to the CCP's rule in People's Republic of China. These are Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and lately South China Sea. South China Sea has been developed as its core interest in after 1975. So, one of the important, there are other elements to the conquest of Tibet like natural resources, frontier state against India, but the major element for the driver for the conquest of Tibet is for legitimacy to rule. One, that is the legitimacy from the People's Republic of China towards CCP. That's point number one. And two, there were also threat to the regime, CCP's regime from inside, and the legitimacy increased due to the conquest of Tibet. So again, survival and legitimacy coupled together led to these conquests in the early part of formation of People's Republic of China or after formation of People's Republic of China. So again, we narrow down to the same point that how the things that were done internally and externally by People's Republic of China under CCP's rule were leading because of their strategy or their drive to survive. All this partially changed after 1989 when Soviet was no longer there. United States emerged as the only superpower. We from bipolarity went into multipolarity, and then the approach was partially diluted, but the survival factor remained, especially in the early 90s till 2008. And then after 2008, when China started building its military capability, or China was confident about its military and economic capability, survival was coupled along with the Tianxia factor of treating neighbors differently. Power combinations started coming along. So once China was at that confidence stage after 2008-2009, things started changing.
The final point that you made was about how now that China is more powerful, it appears that this Tianxia mentality is coming back to the fore. Now, I'll come back to that in a little bit. But Pranay, you have something?
Yeah. So actually, I disagree with both of you. Let me put my points forward why I say so. First of all, I think the broad assumption we should make is that if anyone thinks that domestic policy is complex, welcome to the world of international affairs, which is even more complex than domestic policy making is, right? So that's why obviously there will be many influences. There is civilisational worldview, there are demands for survival, etc., etc., right? So all of them have a role. Another assumption I want people to consider is that the stories that we tell ourselves are very important, right? Narratives have a role, and narratives can really make the unreal real. So it is important to understand what are the stories that people tell themselves about themselves and others, right? And because that shapes this knowledge gets passed on from generation to generation through writings, through how we view the world, through how we view others, through how we view our own people, and these shape how eventually any policy making happens, right? So that's why stories have a role to play, and I just see any civilizational worldview as essentially a story that people tell themselves about their own place and about others, right? So in that sense, I think civilizational worldviews are important. Now, coming to the disagreements part, I don't think we can for sure say that civilizational worldviews have very little influence over a nation's policy conduct. I think it might be more, it might be less, it might be in various ways. Okay, there is no concrete way to say whether it will be very less or more. Coming to the second point about what Suyash mentioned, now he saw survival as being very different from a civilizational worldview, right? I think it's not independent of each other. Okay, civilizational worldview, I mean, who's to say that the civilizational worldview that a nation state or a group of nation state has was actually independent of survival? Maybe it was survival, and legitimacy was one of the reasons for which that civilizational worldview came in place in the first place. So let me give you an example. When you talk about China, right? So why do you say this Tianxia mentality is sort of flowing into survival and legitimacy? In fact, one of the main things that the Tianxia mentality had in mind was that if there is the legitimacy of the mandate of heaven is tested by the amount of territory that emperor controls. So that's why control of Tibet, which Suyash mentioned, or control of Xinjiang gave more legitimacy to a particular ruler. By that time there was no emperor, but to the ruler of who was stationed in Beijing, right? So what you see is that even the civilizational worldview is structured by concerns of legitimacy and survival. They are not independent of each other.
Those are some interesting points, Pranay. So I agree with you to an extent, but I would still say that I feel like the term civilizational worldview still has a much wider kind of conception of an understanding of a people and of a nation than I think what is really at play here. That is something much more simple to wrap our heads around, something that we teach to all of our GCPP students. And that is the concept of the nation as an imagined community. The idea that our nation has been through a particular series of historical experiences, that our nation is exemplified by a particular kind of view, a particular moment in time, is something that was developed by a lot of countries, especially India and China, in the 1940s, 1950s, in the aftermath of the ending of the Second World War. I think India is really has magnificent examples of this process happening, and we can see them happening quite clearly in the light of day, especially with works like Nehru's Discovery of India, especially with the way that history textbooks were written in the period after independence, which kind of emphasized these pan-Indian empires such as the Mauryas, such as the Guptas, the Mughals, and Delhi-centric states as the Delhi Sultanate, very clearly trying to build this idea that, look, India in some form or another has always existed. The India that has existed has always been bounded by the geographical limits of the Indian subcontinent, and it is the destiny of this Indian nation that we define according to these particular texts, according to these particular moments in time, that we are aiming to follow with our own foreign policy. And one can argue that the exact same thing is happening with China as well, where they're looking towards the Qing Empire, they're looking towards the territorial extent of the Qing, or they look at the territorial extent of the Tang and other very powerful Chinese empires, while deliberately ignoring times such as the Sung period. The Sung period, which saw this magnificent kind of flowering of Confucian thought, this reduction in capital punishment. I'm sure India also has like plenty of such periods. It has the periods such as the 15th century when the Delhi Sultanate is declining, the Deccan Sultanates are rising, Vijayanagar is rising, all of which kind of question a lot of the assumptions that are presented in the post-independence national myth. But because the construction of the nation's self-identity is as such, it helps justify the particular political needs of an elite at a particular point of time. Mao needs wide expanses of territory to extract resources from. He needs to be able to settle his soldiers somewhere in Xinjiang. He needs to be able to show that he's following communist ideology by wiping out Xinjiang's pre-existing Muslim culture. All these kind of very presentist political concerns and these very presentist kind of needs to legitimize oneself by pulling on imagined history, I think are much, much easier explanations, much better fitting explanations than a concept of a civilisational worldview.
Okay, I absolutely agree with you. If that's your disagreement, then there's no problem. So we can just change the name of civilisational worldview to elite worldview, and it would be fine, right?
Yep, I think that works a lot better.
Yeah, that's all. Then we have no disagreement. See, the idea is that this is a construction, right? And of course, as I began with by telling that stories are important, and all nation states, all elites will pick up a story that is convenient to them, right? Which poses them in good regard, which poses their idea of nation and their idea of what we are as being more important than people who are not in this construction, right? So obviously we will pick up things which we find convenient. We'll ignore things which will not be. So that will happen. And this is not an exercise in analyzing the evidence and the empirical basis for this. But what we can't disregard is that these stories, even though they might be false, even though they might have myths, they have a bearing on how those nation states and especially the elites of those nation states imagine themselves and conduct themselves, right? That's what we are saying.
Now this I think is, I was agreeing with you in everything that you said up till that very last sentence, which is where I think it's a little difficult to establish, right? And I think it's worth bringing Suyash in at this point because of what he said about, now that China is powerful, we see the resurgence of this Tianxia mentality.
Before you go into that, it's not that we see the emergence of Tianxia mentality. It's also to do with the fact that we are discussing China more, right? So people like us who are, or the Americans who from the outside are looking at China even more closely now, are seeing the shades of this. It's not as if we are not talking about China as an actor and within China whether there was Tianxia earlier or not. It's just that we are looking at it more closely.
Exactly. So in that sense, a civilizational worldview also has another utility, which is not just in terms of formulating and legitimizing the policies of its own elites, but also in helping other elites from other countries understand that country through what they think is how that country constructs itself.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense. Suyash, your thoughts?
Yes, but I disagree with Pranay and Anirudh on imagined communities part or construct, which plays an important role as per the convenience of the ruler in forwarding their interest. I think rather than imagined community part, history and the ground realities based on rulers' assessment of the threat for their survival of the nation state in the contemporary times plays a major role. So, for example, if a policy or if an approach is not derived out of imagined narrative, it is derived based on purely anarchies that exist in international structure and how state as an actors or satellites react to these anarchies. This is the important difference that I make within constructivism and realist lens looking at international relations, and this is also applicable to both China and India while deriving their grand strategies or strategies of existence.
Even I am looking at it from a realist lens itself, right? So what we are saying is that there are emergent realities, there are important questions of survival that nations have to react to, and they will respond to that, right? And so look at that. If there is a set of emergent realities which happen to India now, right? Let's say China is entering into the subcontinent. Okay, there are a lot of countries which it has relationships with. Now, this is the emergent problem for India. Now, India as a realist actor will have 4 or 5 options to this, right? One option could be, hey, just ignore that as long as my survival is ensured. The second one will be that, hey, this is they might actually establish military bases in all these countries and hence it affects my survival, so I have to do something. The third one would be that, hey, my influence in these countries was a lot more and they are taking and China is now replacing India's influence, so I need to do something, right? So broadly, these are 3 options. There might be many more as well. Now, these are all from a realist lens I have derived, right? But which of these options will you choose? That is where this idea of either a civilisational worldview or a historical experience or an elite worldview, whatever you want to call it, will have some influence in picking one of these options. So it sort of changes or the perception of our cost benefit calculation for each of these actions. So that's what I am trying to bring in. There's not much value in trying to say that I don't agree to constructivism, I don't agree to realism. These are like just schools that people have made for their convenience. But what we have to look at it is, do stories and do what we think of ourselves have a role to play in the policy making? I think we do have, and recently the theories of narrative economics and the importance of narratives illustrate that. So that's what I'm coming to. It's not so much about constructivism versus realism, but it is the fact that these realism presents us with a set of options, but the option that you choose finally will have strands from various influences.
I agree, Pranay. I completely agree with what you are trying to. I completely agree with what you are trying to say. But again, I emphasize more on the choices that you have said. The 3 options that you are given are more based on ground realities, more than stories that are constructed over the past. As you have also pointed out, ground realities play a major role, and which is what realist theory tries to emphasize.
Absolutely. No, that's what I said. I don't have any qualms with the idea that there will be emergent realities and concerns will present a more, immediate response it will require from countries. But as I gave you an example, there will still be multiple options that a nation state has, and the cost benefit calculation for each of these options will be determined at least partially by civilisational worldviews. So now let me give you an example, right? Take this Indian subcontinent itself, and I know Anirudh has thoughts on this as well. So what is the idea of the Arthashastra, right? One major thing is about this Rajamandala and the idea that the Indian subcontinent needs to be sort of united in one way or the other, right? And currently, it's not possible politically, and hence people say we should integrate economically at least. Now, I don't agree with this. Okay, first of all, I don't think the subcontinent is the most important part for any nation state. Now, I derive this from a very realist lens, and I think we've done an episode with Dr. Rajesh Rajagopalan as well. He also said that there is no powerful country in the world which has friendly relationships with every single neighbors of it. Okay, there will be powerful nation states will derive some enemies, even in the Arthashastra style, right? You will have a Ari and Mitra developing. Okay, so even if you don't go to that extreme, you will have some neighbors whom you will not be on good terms with. So I don't think subcontinent, especially with the Indian subcontinent that we are in, I think there are some nation states which are very important to India, let's say Bangladesh, but there are other subcontinent nation states which we should look beyond, right? India should look maybe at Indonesia, maybe towards Africa, towards West Asia, etc. And we should not be constrained by this idea of the subcontinent. Having said that, still you see in Indian elite thinking on foreign policy, this idea of the subcontinent is supremely important. It also manifests itself in the focus on Pakistan. Everything in foreign policy until China posed a threat used to start and end with Pakistan, right? Why is that so? That I think that one of the reasons why that is so is because of the civilisational or elite worldview, whatever you want to call it. It is overly obsessed with that. That's why we don't look at the seas, we don't look at our connections with Indonesia, Southeast Asia, etc. Right? That's the point I'm trying to make.
That's an interesting point, Pranay. So, I mean, let me put it this way. If India's capital was in Bangalore, or if India's capital was in Chennai, would India have had the same foreign policy towards the subcontinent?
It wouldn't, but then India's capital wouldn't have been possible in Chennai because of the historical contingencies that have happened, right? But yeah, I agree. If our realities were different, if our concerns were different, if our path dependence was different, then yes, we wouldn't have looked ourselves as overly obsessed with Pakistan and the subcontinent.
Yes, Pranay, to an extent, yes, the historical experiences that were led us to have had a capital in Chennai, of course, are definitely worth fantasizing about. But my overall point is like an elite that is not centered in Delhi, that is not construct its national identity out of the sphere of Central Asian invasions, but instead constructs a national identity based on trade with the broader Indian Ocean world, and that has this historical construct of itself as dominating Indonesia and projecting influence as far away as Vietnam, might have had a profoundly different kind of way of structuring its foreign policy.
Absolutely, I agree. But that didn't happen. That's all the point.
Yeah. Suyash?
I completely again disagree on this part. I've started, so for 60-70% of what Pranay said, I agree. And then I started disagreeing. So for example, you guys made a claim that if India's capital was in South, then the foreign policy perhaps could have been different, or approach to Pakistan perhaps could have been different. I disagree on that part because the things with Pakistan are essentially based on territory. Any state, irrespective of its capital, are not ready to bargain mostly unless the threats are matching on territorial part. So because it is based on territory, it is based on survival of the land, or irrespective of where the capital is. India's foreign policy towards Pakistan would be.
Suyash, I will interrupt you here. I'm not saying in terms of territory. You are assuming that what we are saying is that if let's say we are completely conjecturing, here, that if the capital was somewhere else, our policy towards Pakistan would have been more friendlier because the people who are away from Pakistan would have seen it differently, right? That's what you're saying.
Correct.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. I'm saying, in fact, it might also have been the case that we would have been completely, more belligerent towards Pakistan. Let me explain why I say that. See, it's not just about territory. If you see the links of, say, Punjabis in India with Punjabis in Pakistan, there are deep links. In fact, even Manmohan Singh, when he was the Prime Minister, made a very emotive speech on this about his links. His old place was on that side of the border, etc. Right? So it is an important thing from a personal and what people imagine themselves as for a people of territory closer to Pakistan. Okay, it's not just about territory. So what I'm saying is, maybe if the elite were different, maybe we would have taken Pakistan as from a very realistic lens, right? Just that we have to protect our territory, we'll do whatever we need to do to control Pakistan. Right? But now it's not just that. It's not just about territory. There are deep linkages of people. People see themselves as they used to. There are similarities between us and them and all that, right? That complicates the thing. So it's not just about territory is what I wanted.
But I think I can see Suyash's overall point. He's saying that the way that we are talking about this is that we are assigning a great deal of influence to an elite's self-understanding of their role and their destiny and what their nation needs to do. Whereas what he's saying is that there's something far deeper, which is these hard-nosed calculations of territory and security. Is that right, Suyash?
Correct. Which are more important deriving factor. And I also agreed with that. So which are more important deriving factor than the civilisational factor. Civilisational factor may play a role, but if it is kept against one another, then these factors are always given importance. If they are not kept against one another, then civilisational factor may perhaps.
Okay.
This is what I'm trying to say.
So if I can present a synthesis of everything that we've kind of argued so far. let's say I would actually try to extend this, both of your ideas a little further back in the entire process. First of all, the idea of a particular kind of national identity that determines what is acceptable for a nation to do, what is desirable for a nation to do, can play some kind of role, a minimal role perhaps, but still some kind of role in just conceptualizing how a nation approaches its grand strategy. When it comes to particular dilemmas, when it comes to approaching a nation, definitely I think that we are at a point where we have sophisticated enough systems of foreign policy analysis where we come up with what might seem to be objective options, but still considering that there can be no such thing as like a perfectly objective observer, right? Since even foreign policy options are developed by people who are steeped in a particular kind of historical understanding of who they are and who their nation is. Even those options that they think of as being perfectly objective might very well be influenced in some way that is very difficult for us to establish by this elite self-presentation, by this concept of nation that has been built. And that in turn, over decades, over many small decisions, I think would definitely have some kind of influence in the way that a nation presents itself. And I think that there are many kind of historical examples to support this kind of synthesis that we're all talking about. If you look at a lot of older Indian states, especially such as Vijayanagara, you see that the self-presentation of the elite has a great deal to do with the way that they structure not only domestic policy but also foreign policy. Especially in its early years, you see literature which kind of justifies their conquest of the Madurai Sultanate. Later on, you will see literature that describes the Deccan sultans who at one point were the vassals of the Vijayanagara emperor as being basically manifestations of Shiva or Vishnu, while the Vijayanagara emperor is a manifestation of Vishnu or Shiva. So in very interesting ways, this way that literature and texts are kind of used to justify or to support pre-existing decisions which might have had much more contingent kind of political and strategic factors can be seen going quite far back, and you don't necessarily need to talk about a single normative text to kind of understand that process.
Well summarized, Anirudh. Just one point I would like to add is we are assuming that terms such as survival are very objectively defined, whereas terms such as civilisational worldviews, etc., are very subjective, right? But if you see even the terms, even something like survival is very subjective, right? Like how did the Chinese construction, for example, say that Xinjiang or Tibet is very important for their survival, right? It is constructed because they thought that if this is gone away, it will, lead to something of a slippery slope and there will be nothing left. Now again, it is a construction, right? Maybe some other state in some other history would have thought of that. Okay, it's not that important, right?
Exactly. I think survival of a nation state implies two things, right? Survival of the state and survival of the nation. And nation, given how subjective a concept it is, given that it is fundamentally an imagined community, if China's self-identity was about being a highly multi-ethnic state like India, it might have been much more okay with coexisting with Tibetans and Uyghurs than it currently is. Maybe it would not have seen allowing them to be equal citizens as being a threat to the concept of a Han nation.
But here we are missing out on a major point, which Anirudh pointed out: survival of a nation and survival of a state. Here, from a realist lens, survival of a state thrives the survival of a nation. So state includes state apparatus, state boundaries, and that is why it is sacrosanct.
It is not sacrosanct in the sense, anyways, these were outside the imagined boundaries of the Chinese state itself, right, at one point of time. So it was not like, it is like core area, which if you lost, there will be, health to be paid for, there's nothing left, right? In that sense. In fact, I would add a third point. It's not just nation and state, it is also country, right? The way nation is a mental construct and state is a political construct and country is a geographical construct. So what we are saying is, you need to have a particular geographical expanse that falls under the domain of country, right? And all these have varied importance. And all the varied importance is ascribed to them by what people think, by what elites think of each of these in their own mind, right? What is more important?
let us agree to disagree and leave it over here.
Yeah, on that note, before our editor comes and attacks us for going on forever, thank you guys so much for joining me. This has been a really enjoyable and fun conversation, and I hope that all of our listeners enjoyed it as well. So thank you for joining me, and thank you for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. So another really fun week on the network. I don't know if you saw this, but Varun Thakur was on Advertising is Dead. That was a really, really fun episode. Besides that, we've had some great guests all over the place. We had Ram Madhvani on Cyrus Says. We had Saurav Mukherjee, a legend in the finance space. He was on Paisa Vaisa. He and Anupam have co-written a book, so definitely do check out that episode and go buy their book too. I mean, like, that would be another great thing to do. Uncle Pleasted had a really, really cool episode with hosts of our other show, Mr. and Mrs. Binge Watch, Anirudh and Janice. They were talking about celebrity culture and how that's progressed for the last few years. And yeah, it's just been a really, really great week. One episode I do want to shout out. A couple of weeks ago, Pulyabazi did an episode which was just amazing. They were talking about the letters between Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. Do check those out. Those are really good. And with that, hope to see you again next week.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Vaisa, the show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa Vaisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have.